You need to leave this cabin right now. The shrill voice of the neighborhood busybody, our very own Hokarina, shattered the calm of my morning. She was flapping around a stack of bogus-looking inspection papers, barking orders like she owned the place. This unhinged woman was insisting I vacate my grandfather's cabin immediately, threatening to dial 911 if I didn't comply. Naturally, I told her, "Lady, I'm not going anywhere." That was all it, 'cause she pulled out her phone and punched in the emergency number right there in my yard. But here's the twist, she had no clue what she was walking into. The call she was about to make wasn't going to end the way she thought. Because sometimes, the person you're trying to scare off has a few secrets you could never predict. Let me back up a little. My name is Robert Harris, although everyone just calls me Bob. I'm 60 years old, a retired auto mechanic, and all I want these days is some peace and quiet. After losing my wife last year, I moved into my grandfather Samuel's old cabin. It's not much, just a modest log home built in the 60s, but to me, it's everything. My grandfather raised me after my parents passed, and this cabin is a part of him. Fixing it up has been my way of keeping his memory alive. So there I was, on a Tuesday morning, swapping out a few rotten boards on the porch when I heard a car door slam. I looked up to see a blonde woman in her mid-40s storming toward me with the determination of a drill sergeant. She had on one of those high-visibility vests you'd expect to see on a county worker, except it looked cheap and out of place. In her hands, a clipboard, a measuring tape, and an attitude that screamed superiority. Something about her immediately set me on edge. You ever get that gut feeling that someone is trouble the moment you see them? That was here multiplied by 10. Before she even reached the porch, she snapped, "Sir, I'm Diana Stone, official county building inspector. This structure is in violation of emergency safety codes." She brandished her clipboard like it was a weapon. I just stood there, stunned. In 3 years of living here, I'd never once seen a county inspector, and suddenly this stranger was trying to evict me from my own property? She rambled on about emergency evacuation orders and immediate compliance, reading her lines like a bad actor in a courtroom drama. But here's the thing, I might not be a genius, but I know a fake when I see one. The vest looked like it came from a bargain website. Her official badge was nothing but laminated printer paper with building safety inspector typed in a boring font. Even the forms on her clipboard looked suspicious, generic copies with my address scribbled in by hand. Trying to stay calm, I said, "Ma'am, I think you've got this wrong. This is my home. I'll legally own it, and I've never received any notice about violations." She glared at me like I just declared gravity was a myth. "Sir, you are in violation of County Ordinance 47B, requiring immediate evacuation of condemned structures," she snapped. That's when I felt my patience slipping. This woman was trespassing on my property, waving around fake documents, and demanding I abandon the very place I'd poured my heart into. "Listen," I told her, "I don't know what scam you're pulling, but I'm not leaving. This is my land, my cabin, and you need to get off it before I call the real police." Wrong move. Her face turned crimson, her hands shook, and she erupted. "How dare you? This structure is a danger to the community. I have official proof this building is condemned." She dug into her folder and pulled out what looked like a demolition order, county letterhead and all. For half a second, I actually wondered if some mix-up had happened behind the scenes. But then I remembered my grandfather's words, "Bobby, if someone's trying to pressure you, that's when you need to stop and think." So I said, "All right Dana, if this is official, you won't mind if I call the county office to confirm." Her mask slipped instantly, the confidence drained from her face, replaced by panic. "That won't be necessary," she stammered. "These orders are time-sensitive. You need to leave right now." I turned to grab my phone anyway, and that's when she completely lost it. "You're trespassing on condemned property," she shrieked, pulling out her own phone. "I'm calling the authorities." And right there in my front yard, she dialed 911. I stood in disbelief as she put on her best official voice. "Yes, this is County Inspector Diana Stone. I have a hostile homeowner refusing to evacuate an unsafe dwelling. He's aggressive and threatening me." My jaw nearly hit the floor. She was flat out lying to emergency services, claiming I was violent when all I'd done was question her phony credentials. 10 minutes later, sirens echoed up the valley. Perfect. Now I'd have to explain this circus to the police. But when the patrol car pulled up, relief washed over me. The officer was Sergeant Tommy Russo, a man I'd known for years. He's been patrolling this area forever. He knew me, my grandfather, and this land. Tommy stepped out, took one look at Diana's dollar store vest and my bewildered face, and I could practically see him fighting back an eye roll. "Ma'am," he said evenly, "where's your county-issued identification? Because that vest looks like something from a costume shop." Diana sputtered about emergency safety protocols and time-sensitive violations, but Tommy wasn't buying a word of it. He dealt with enough real inspectors to know she wasn't one of them. Then he turned to me. "Bob, she claims you threatened her. Is that true?" I shook my head. "Not at all, Officer Russo. I only asked to verify her paperwork because none of this felt legitimate." Tommy nodded, then faced her again. "Ma'am, do you actually have the legal authority to issue evacuation orders?" She launched into a rant about HOA emergency powers and community safety, but Tommy cut her off mid-sentence. "Thought so," he said firmly. "Ma'am, you need to leave this man's property now." Then something unexpected happened. Instead of storming off like Tommy had ordered, Diana gave me this unsettling smile. She looked me dead in the eye and said, "You think this is over, Mr. Harrison? You have no idea what your family did to mine." Her tone sent a chill straight through me. This wasn't just some random fraud pulling a scam. This was personal, and Tommy must have felt it too, because as Diana walked back toward her car, he leaned in close and spoke quietly. "Bob," he said, "your grandfather left something for you inside that cabin. He told me it would protect the Harrison family if the Stones ever came back. Have you found it yet?" What Tommy revealed in that moment flipped my entire perspective. I had thought I was just dealing with some unstable woman in a costume, but now there was a deeper connection, as something tied to family history I'd never been told. When Diana finally drove away, I was relieved her phony inspector act had been shut down, but Tommy's words gnawed at me. The Stones. I'd never even heard that name before, yet the way Diana had looked at me, full of venom, it was clear there was old, ugly history buried here. Tommy stayed behind for a bit, leaning against his cruiser as if he were weighing how much to share. "Your grandfather didn't like talking about the past," he said, "but a few times he mentioned the Stone family, said there was bad blood. It goes back to the 1960s. Something about a land dispute that turned nasty." He glanced down the road at the spot where Diana had been parked, shaking his head. "Sam always told me if a Stone ever came back around here, you'd find what you needed to deal with it hidden in that cabin." He was real specific about that, I'll admit. At first I thought Tommy was exaggerating and just repeating some old man's tale about grudges that should have died out decades ago. But after what I'd just witnessed, the way Diana acted like she had some rightful claim over my property, maybe Samuel had known exactly what he was talking about. When I pressed Tommy for details, he only shrugged. "Honestly, Bob, I figured it was just an old-timer's paranoia. But after today, after seeing her show up in a fake vest, inventing evacuation orders, I think your grandfather had a damn good reason to be concerned." The next morning, I woke up to a sight that made my stomach drop. Diana's car was parked at the end of my driveway again, but this time she hadn't come alone. With her were 3 others, all carrying clipboards, cameras, and measuring gear. From my kitchen window, it looked like they were conducting an excavation on my land. I stormed outside. "Excuse me," I called, "but you're on private property. You don't have permission to be here." Diana snapped right back into her official persona, voice raised as if performing for an audience. "Mr. Yaw, if Tommy was right, then whatever my grandfather left behind in the cabin was meant for exactly this kind of trouble." And Diana without a doubt was Stone family trouble. I headed toward the tool shed, figuring if Samuel had hidden anything important, that was the place. But the moment I started walking, I realized Diana was tailing me, phone in hand, recording every step. "Day 2 of Harrison occupation," she narrated dramatically into the camera. like she was hosting some courtroom reality show. Subject continues to resist lawful evacuation orders and is now attempting to access hidden materials. She wasn't just unhinged as she was calculated. Every picture, every clip, she was building some kind of case, like she planned to drag me into court. That's when I noticed something even more disturbing. Diana and her so-called assistants weren't just wandering around randomly. They were documenting the exact locations of the old boundary stones. Pete was jotting down coordinates, measuring distances, while she snapped photos like they were mapping the land with military precision. This wasn't harassment anymore. This was a plan. My pulse kicked up as I reached the shed. What if Samuel had hidden something here, and what if Diana already knew about it? It took me nearly 20 minutes to saw through the rusty lock. Finally, I swung the door open and stepped into Samuel's world. Everything was organized just as he'd kept it when I was a boy. Tools hanging neatly on the walls, jars of nails and screws labeled in his tidy handwriting, and in the corner stood the old filing cabinet. Right above it, on a hook, hung a single key with a tag that read, "For Bobia emergency only." My hands trembled as I slid the key into the lock. Inside the top drawer was a folder labeled, "Emergency Documentation A Robert Only." I opened it and almost dropped it. The first pages contained Samuel's handwritten account of events from 1965, and it told a story I had never heard. According to my grandfather, Eugene Stone hadn't simply lost his farm to bad luck or gambling debts. He'd been knee-deep in an illegal moonshine operation, tied up with organized crime. When things spiraled out of control, Eugene begged Samuel to buy the farm quickly, in caution no questions asked. But Eugene also made Samuel promise something: never reveal the real reason for the sale. He feared that if anyone knew about his mob connections, his family would be in danger. So Samuel took the blame, allowing the Stones to paint him as a greedy land thief instead of exposing the truth. For 60 years, my grandfather had carried that burden wearing the label of a villain when, in reality, he had saved the Stones from ruin. Tucked in the folder was a letter in Eugene's own handwriting. "Thank you, Samuel, for protecting my family from the consequences of my foolish choices. Someday the truth will come out." But Eugene never got the chance to tell his side. He died in a car wreck just 2 years later, and the lie lived on. As I sifted through the documents, I uncovered something even more earth-shattering: a 1952 survey map labeled Harrison Valley Property. It showed that Samuel Harrison owned 2,000 acres. 2,000. The map outlined everything: the roads, the community center, even the very houses where people like Diana lived. All of it sat on Harrison land, and the paperwork backed it up. Over the years, Samuel had granted easements and development rights but never sold the land itself, which meant every house, every streetlight, every inch of that neighborhood technically still belonged to the Harrison family. Among the papers was a note from my grandfather: "If the Stones ever come for revenge, show them this deed. They live on your land and don't even realize it." He'd been preparing me for this moment my whole life, even if I hadn't known it. Before I could process everything, I heard car doors slamming outside. I grabbed the critical documents and peered out the window. Diana wasn't alone anymore. She had an entire crowd with her 8, maybe 9 people marching straight toward my cabin like an angry mob. I stepped outside to face them. Diana led the charge, Pete trailing close behind, Laura with her toddler on her hip, and several other neighbors glaring at me like I was a criminal. "There he is," Diana shouted, "the man who's been fraudulently occupying community land and threatening residents." But not everyone seemed convinced. Laura hung back, her face skeptical. That's when I decided to drop the bombshell. I strode forward, holding the old survey map high. "Actually, Diana, you and Paytau and probably everyone else here are standing on Harrison family land. This 1952 survey proves it." The look on Diana's face was priceless. For a moment, her entire worldview seemed to shatter, but instead of backing down, she doubled down. "Forgery," she screeched. "Classic Harrison fraud tactics." Yet I could see the doubt flickering in Pete's eyes, and Laura stepped closer, peering at the map with genuine curiosity. That's when I pulled out Eugene's letter. "Diana," I said evenly, "your great-grandfather wasn't some noble farmer cheated out of his land. He was running moonshine, deep in debt to the mob. My grandfather saved him. I bought the farm to keep your family alive. Here's the proof." In Eugene's own handwriting. The crowd went silent. Even the air felt heavy. Pete finally stepped forward, his face pale. "Let me see that letter." I handed it over. He studied it for a long moment, then turned to Diana. His voice was quiet but firm. "Diana, a broken bar. I'm conducting a follow-up safety inspection under County Ordinance 47B. These are my authorized assistants." The three nodded solemnly, like actors in a staged production. One of them was literally crouched in my yard, measuring grass with a ruler. But what really set me off was when I noticed another of her assistants taking photographs and not of the cabin, but of the old granite posts scattered along the property line. I'd always thought they were nothing more than relics, maybe old fence markers, but as I looked closer, I realized there was writing carved into them, chiseled deep into the stone. The words read, S. Harrison A. 1952. My jaw dropped. These weren't fence posts, they were boundary markers my grandfather had placed more than 70 years ago. I confronted Diana immediately. "These stones have my grandfather's name and the year 1952 carved into them. How could your HOA possibly have installed them 20 years before this neighborhood even existed?" For a brief second, her confidence cracked. Panic flickered across her face before she quickly masked it. "Those carvings are forgeries," she snapped. Classic Harrison trickery, faking evidence to steal land. Right on cue, one of her Eliasa, a grain man who introduced himself as Pete Kowalski, jumped in. "She's right," he said firmly. "I've lived in this valley 15 years. The Harrisons have always stirred up trouble with property lines." Fantastic. So she'd been poisoning the neighbors against me for years, building a narrative long before I even knew there was a fight to be had. But then, a younger woman in the group, Laura, spoke up. "I don't know, Diana. My parents bought our place directly from Mr. Harrison back in the 80s. He was kind and straightforward. Why would his grandson suddenly be trying to reclaim land decades later?" Finally, someone with common sense. Diana whirled on her, voice rising theatrically. "Don't let him deceive you, Laura. The Harrisons have run property scams in this valley for generations. They sell houses that aren't theirs, then return years later claiming trespass. It's exactly what my grandmother warned me about." She was red-faced now, waving her stack of bogus papers like they were damning evidence. And in that instant, I knew, if Tommy was right about my grandfather leaving something behind, I had to find it. Because whatever this was, Diana wasn't going to stop. Pete studied the letter carefully, his face paling as he whispered, "There's a broken bar. This really looks like Eugene's handwriting." That was the moment Diana snapped. She lunged forward, clawing at Pete's hands to snatch the letter away. "It's a fake!" she screamed. "Computer-generated, photoshopped garbage." But her frantic desperation only made her look less believable. Laura stepped in, her voice calm but cutting through the chaos. "Diana, I've lived here all my life. My parents bought our house from Samuel Harrison in 1982. I always wondered why we never had an official deed, just something called a residential easement. If Bob inherited everything Sam owned, are you saying my house legally belongs to him?" Before I could answer that loaded question, Diana made her most reckless move yet. She whipped out her phone and called 911 again. "This is Diana Stone reporting active property fraud," she declared loudly for everyone to hear. "A man is using forged documents to lay false claim to multiple homes." I couldn't help but laugh. "Diana, you do realize Sergeant Trusso will respond to that call, right? The same officer who caught you impersonating an inspector yesterday?" But she wasn't thinking rationally anymore. That's when I decided to settle this once and for all. I dialed the county surveyor's office on speaker. "This is Robert Harrison out in the valley. I need an emergency boundary survey to resolve a land dispute." 20 minutes, the clerk said. Those 20 minutes dragged on endlessly. Diana paced the yard like a cornered animal, documenting everything with her phone. Pete and a few others quietly examined the letter and map, while Laura juggled her restless toddler and her growing unease. When the surveyor's truck finally arrived, Diana bolted toward him, her fake title spilling from her lips. "Sir, I'm Diana Stone, Community Safety Coordinator. This man is staging a fraudulent land grab." The surveyor gave her a polite nod. then calmly replied that he would verify everything himself. For the next hour, he worked methodically at GPS measurements, satellite imagery, old records, and databases. Diana shadowed him every step, ranting about conspiracies and demanding he disregard my so-called forgeries. Finally, he packed up his gear and gathered everyone around. I've compared the 1952 Harrison survey to current county records and GPS markers. Everything matches. The documents are genuine. Mr. Harrison legally owns approximately 2,000 acres including 47 homes, the community center, and most of the valley's roads. Relief washed over me, but before I could celebrate, Diana smirked with a chilling calm. You think you've won? You don't know half of what your grandfather did. The land was only the beginning. Her words sent a shiver down my spine. She wasn't bluffing. There was something else, something I didn't know about Samuel. Instead of conceding, Diana spun her story for the crowd, her voice rising in hysteria. Don't you see? This is a massive Harrison scam. They've corrupted county officials, forged decades of documents, and bribed surveyors to steal our homes. Even Pete, once her staunch ally, shook his head. Diana, a broken bar. I've known Mike here for 15 years. He surveyed my garage. He's no part of a conspiracy. But Diana wouldn't let go. She filmed herself like a journalist at the scene of a crime. Day 3 of the Harrison takeover, she narrated, corrupt officials and fabricated surveys being used to push families off their land. I knew then that if I didn't take control, this madness would spiral out of hand. So I marched to the community center, the very building the surveyor confirmed was technically mania, and raised my voice. Since I'm apparently the legal owner here, I'm calling an emergency community meeting. Anyone who wants the truth, meet me inside in 10 minutes. Within the hour, the center was packed. Word had spread fast. Dozens of neighbors of faces I recognized but had barely spoken to were crowded inside. Pete and Laura sat in the middle, dazed and unsettled. Diana shoved her way to the front, clinging to her clipboard like a lifeline. I spread the old survey map across a table. Folks, I know this is overwhelming. 3 days ago, I didn't know any of this either, but according to official surveys and county records, my grandfather, Samuel Ya, owned all this land. He allowed development, granted easements, but never sold the ground beneath your homes. The room erupted in voices, confusion, and panic. This looks like Eugene's handwriting, Pete muttered. That was the breaking point for Diana. She lunged at him, clawing for the letter. It's fake, she screamed. Computer generated, doctored, but her frantic behavior only made her look guiltier. Laura stepped forward, her voice steady but cutting through Diana's hysteria like a blade. Diana, I've lived in this valley my entire life. My parents bought our house back in 1982 directly from Samuel Harrison. We never got a deed, only something called a residential easement. If Bob inherited everything, Sam owned a broken bar. Are you saying my house belongs to him? Before I could even attempt to answer, Diana played her next desperate card. She whipped out her phone and called 911. This is Diana Stone, reporting an active property fraud. A man is using forged paperwork to claim ownership of multiple homes. I couldn't help but laugh. Diana, you realize Sergeant Russo will respond, right? The same officer who caught you impersonating a county inspector yesterday? She didn't even flinch. Her grip on reality had slipped entirely. That's when I decided I was done with the circus. I pulled out my phone and dialed the county surveyor's office. Loud enough for everyone to hear, I said, "Hi, this is Robert Harrison out in the valley. I need an emergency boundary survey to settle a property dispute." 20 minutes, they told me, and those 20 minutes felt like hours. Diana prowled around my yard like a caged animal, filming everything, snapping photos, muttering to herself. Pete and a few others stayed glued to Eugene's letter and the survey map. Laura juggled her restless toddler, clearly torn between disbelief and dawning realization. When the county surveyor's truck rolled in, Diana darted forward before he even stepped out. "Sir," she shouted, "I'm Diana Stone, Community Safety Coordinator. This man is making fraudulent claims." The surveyor gave her a polite nod but cut her off gently. "I'll review all documents and take my own measurements." For the next hour, he worked meticulously setting GPS markers, comparing satellite images with historical maps, cross-checking databases on his tablet. Diana shadowed him the entire time, barking demands to ignore my forgeries. Finally, he packed up and gathered everyone together. Folks, I've compared the 1952 Harrison survey with current county records and GPS readings. Everything checks out. The boundary markers line up perfectly. Mr. Harrison, you are the rightful owner of roughly 2,000 acres including 47 residential lots, the community center, and most of the access roads. The crowd buzzed. I felt relief wash over me, but Diana's reaction chilled me. She didn't crumble, she smirked. You think you've won? You don't know what your grandfather really did to my family. The land was just the start. Her words cut through my celebration. She said it with such venom, as if she carried knowledge I didn't. But before I could question her, she turned on the crowd, gesturing wildly at the surveyor's equipment. Don't you get it? This is a setup. The Harrisons have corrupted the county, forged the records, even faked this survey. They're stealing our homes right in front of us. Even Pete, who'd been her strongest ally, shook his head. Diana, a broken bar. I've known Mike for 15 years. He surveyed my land when I built my garage. He's not part of some conspiracy. She didn't hear him. She was too far gone. Holding her phone out like a microphone, she narrated to her camera. Day 3 of the Harrison takeover. Subject now using corrupt county officials to legitimize fraudulent claims. A broken bar, that was it. I had to seize control before her paranoia consumed the entire valley. I strode to the community center property I now technically own and raised my voice. Since I'm, apparently, the legal owner here, I'm calling an emergency community meeting. Anyone who wants real answers, meet me inside in 10 minutes. By the time I stepped inside, the place was packed. Word had spread fast, and nearly every resident within miles had shown up, worried about their homes. Diana shoved her way to the front, still clutching that ridiculous clipboard like a lifeline. Pete and Laura sat in the middle, both dazed, trying to make sense of a truth that upended everything they thought they knew. Around them were neighbors I'd seen for years but barely spoken to, people who'd been living quietly until Diana turned their world upside down. I stood before them, spreading the survey map across a table. I know this is confusing and probably frightening. Until a few days ago, I didn't know any of this myself, but according to county records and verified surveys, my grandfather, Samuel Harrison, never sold the land your homes are built on. He allowed residential easements and development rights back in the 70s and 80s, but he kept ownership of the land itself. The room erupted in a storm of voices. The room grew tense. From what I can see, Mr. Harrison's claim is legitimate, Tommy stated firmly. Ms. Stone's arguments appear to be based on family stories that don't align with the documented history. That's when Diana made her most reckless move yet. Instead of taking a moment to process the facts or even questioning Tommy calmly, she lashed out. You're all part of it, she screamed, jabbing a finger at Tommy, the surveyor, and me. The Harrisons have been bribing officials for decades, as if this whole county is rotten. Tommy's patience vanished in an instant. His voice dropped into the unmistakable tone of an officer. Ma'am, accusing law enforcement of corruption without evidence is a serious allegation. If you can't back it up, you're bordering on filing a false report. But Diana was past the point of caring. She yanked out a thick folder I hadn't seen before and held it high like it contained undeniable proof. I have records, she declared. Financial statements, meeting notes, correspondence, everything I need to expose the Harrison family conspiracy. For a second, my heart skipped. What if she really did uncover something damning about my grandfather? What if there was a part of the story I had never been told? Tommy asked to see the supposed evidence. When Diana finally opened the folder, it was nothing more than a collage of old news clippings, random internet articles, and pages printed from conspiracy websites. She had clearly spent years piecing together scraps of unrelated events, trying to frame the Harrisons as puppet masters of the county. The most absurd evidence was a decades-old newspaper article about his owning variants Samuel had filed to build a workshop. Diana had highlighted every line, scribbling notes in the margins about shady approvals and bribes that only existed in her imagination. As she rambled on, something shifted. I quietly unfolded the sealed letter my grandfather had left behind. What I read made my stomach turn and confirmed why Samuel had always feared the Stones' obsession with our family. Tucked inside were several legal documents, along with a handwritten note. Bobby, if you're reading this, Diana Stone has likely come around, accusing us of stealing her family's land. For years, she's been sending threatening letters to my attorney, swearing to take revenge. What she doesn't know is the truth about her great-grandfather's crimes. She is dangerous. The documents enclosed will protect you legally, but be careful. This woman has devoted her entire life to plotting against us. The accompanying files were even more disturbing. It turned out Diana had waged a relentless campaign against Samuel long before he passed. Multiple lawsuits dismissed accused him of fraud. She had bombarded county officials with demands for investigations, even tried dragging the state attorney general into what she called the biggest land theft conspiracy in county history. But one document froze me in place, a restraining order. Just months before his death, Samuel had gone to court after Diana was repeatedly caught trespassing on his property, taking measurements, snapping photos, and leaving threatening notes about reclaiming Stone land. The order barred her from coming within 500 yards of any Harrison property. I looked up from the papers, stunned, while Diana continued her tirade, unaware I now held proof of her long-standing harassment. Tommy noticed the change in my expression. "Bob, you okay? You look like you've seen a ghost." Wordlessly, I handed him the restraining order. His face went through the same cycle of shock, then realization. "Ma'am," he interrupted, holding up the document. "Are you Diana Stone of 1872 Meadow Lane?" Diana faltered, blinking in confusion. "Yes." "Why?" "Because this order," Tommy said flatly, "forbids you from being within 500 years of any Harrison property. This community center is Harrison land, which means you're trespassing again and currently in violation of a court order." The look on Diana's face was priceless. She had either forgotten about the order or assumed it died with my grandfather. But restraining orders don't disappear when the petitioner passes it. They remain in effect, especially when tied to property inherited by family. "That can't be," Diana stammered. "That order was against him, not his grandson." Tommy shook his head and reached for his cuffs. "Ma'am, the wording clearly protects Harrison property, regardless of who holds it. Either you leave right now, or I'll have to arrest you." Diana's instinct was to clutch her folder and start backing toward the exit. But before leaving, she couldn't resist one last threat. "This isn't over," she shouted. "I have Eliasa connections you know nothing about, people who understand what your family really is." At the door, she turned and delivered a final line that left the entire room uneasy. "You think your grandfather is resting peacefully? Think again. What he did to my family is still poisoning lives today, and I'll make sure the world hears the truth." Then she stormed out, leaving behind a stunned crowd and me holding undeniable proof that Diana had been tormenting my grandfather for decades. After discovering my grandfather had been stalked for years, the evening took an even darker turn. Once the neighbors left and I sat alone in the cabin, trying to process everything, the phone rang. It was Tommy, and his tone told me something was wrong. "Bob," he said, "Diana just made her first phone call from lockup. Turns out, her late husband left her a sizable inheritance. She's using that money to hire a top-tier lawyer from the state capitol. They're preparing to hit you with a federal civil rights case." The thought of Diana having resources and a plan decades in the making sent a chill through me. In the holding cell, she ended that phone call with a triumphant smile, telling the guard, "You think this is over, Harrison?" My family's been waiting for this moment for 60 years. Before I knew it, I was standing in a federal courthouse, a place far more intimidating than anything I'd ever dealt with. Up until then, the most serious legal trouble I'd faced was a speeding ticket. Now I was staring down a civil rights lawsuit crafted by Diana's high-powered attorney, Catherine Vale. The complaint accused my family of orchestrating a 60-year conspiracy to strip the Stones of their rights and property. To me, it sounded absurd, but Vale, known for winning high-profile property rights cases, made it sound frighteningly plausible. My lawyer, Jim Patterson, was a decent, hard-working local attorney of the kind who usually handled divorces and DUIs. He knew his stuff, but compared to Vale's polished presence, it felt like I had brought a pocket knife to a gunfight. When court opened, Diana looked like a completely different person. Gone was the disheveled woman waving conspiracy clippings. In her place was someone composed, professional, dressed sharply, exuding the aura of a victim simply seeking justice. Judge Margaret Chen presided as Vale delivered her opening remarks. She portrayed the Stone family as victims of systemic oppression, robbed by a powerful family who used money and influence to bury the truth. She cast Samuel Harrison as a corrupt man who preyed on a desperate farmer and silenced him with political pull. Your Honor, Vale declared, this isn't about a simple land dispute, it's about decades of unjust racism, classism, and abuse of power that robbed the Stone family of their rightful heritage. She even went so far as to argue that my recent confirmation of property rights was nothing more than an elaborate cover-up, the final step in a decades-long forgery scheme to legitimize theft. When it was Jim's turn, he calmly laid out what we had. He submitted Eugene's handwritten confession, where he admitted his crimes and thanked Samuel for saving his family. He presented the county surveyor's report verifying the 1952 boundaries. He even brought in an expert to authenticate the letter, proving it was written in the 1960s. But Vale's team was ready for every angle. They had their own handwriting specialist who claimed the letter could have been faked using old paper and ink. They pointed to Samuel's involvement on the Planning Commission years later as evidence of political power. They even called longtime residents who recalled hearing rumors of the Harrisons taking advantage of struggling farmers. The most persuasive testimony came from Diana herself. Taking the stand in a simple black dress, holding a worn photo of her great-grandfather Eugene, she spun a heartbreaking narrative. She described a childhood in poverty, listening to her grandmother's stories about the farm they lost, and her lifelong dream of restoring the Stone family's name. Your Honor, she said, voice trembling, I don't want money, I don't want vengeance. I only want acknowledgement of what was done to my family and for the land that belongs to us to be restored to our name. Her performance was so convincing I saw people in the gallery nodding in agreement. But then Jim surprised me. While combing through Samuel's papers, he had found something I hadn't seen before. During cross-examination, he asked Diana about her research into the 1965 sale. Ms. Stone, he began, in your years of investigation, did you ever review the original sale records at the county recorder's office? Of course, Diana answered confidently. That's how I proved your client's grandfather bought our farm. Jim gave a small nod and opened a folder. And did you notice the other document filed that same day, the one explaining why your great-grandfather was in such a hurry to sell? Vale jumped to her feet, objecting that this was outside the scope of the case. But Judge Chen allowed him to continue. What Jim revealed next would change everything. Jim uncovered a lien release filed on the very same day the farm was sold. It showed that Eugene Stone had owed $47,000 to a company called Mountain State Collection Services. Digging deeper, Jim learned that the so-called company was nothing more than a front for organized crime, a group notorious for collecting gambling debts through threats and violence. The lien release proved that Samuel Harrison had quietly stepped in and paid off Eugene's debt as part of the farm purchase, essentially paying double the farm's value just to keep Eugene alive. Alongside that, Jim presented sheriff's office phone records showing Eugene had repeatedly called for protection in the weeks before the sale, reporting threats from shadowy figures demanding immediate payment. The effect on Diana was explosive. All the composure she had shown during the trial evaporated. Shaking her head furiously, she blurted out, loud enough for the entire courtroom to hear, "That can't be true. My grandmother always told me they were honest farmers. They didn't gamble." Judge Chen paused proceedings, calling for a short recess so Diana could consult with her attorneys. But the damage was already done. When court resumed, Catherine Vale moved to dismiss the case on the grounds that new evidence had altered the heart of the dispute. Diana, however, refused to be silenced. Against her lawyer's frantic gestures, she stood and began addressing the judge directly. "Your Honor, I don't care what these papers say," she cried, her voice rising with desperation. "I've spent 3 decades fighting for justice for my family. I won't stop now. These people are criminals, and I'll prove it." As Catherine tried in vain to rein her in, Diana grew louder, accusing the Harrisons of covering up decades of crime. Her outburst escalated until she was shouting about conspiracies, claiming the courtroom itself was bought and paid for by Harrison money. When she pointed at Judge Chen and accused him directly of corruption, the judge had no choice but to cite her for contempt. Security moved in, and Diana was dragged out of the courtroom, still screaming accusations of cover-ups and betrayal. Yet, just before being taken out, she locked eyes with me and mouthed 4 chilling words that froze me in place. "Check the old well." On the drive home, I tried to dismiss it as another paranoid rant, but the way she said it gnawed at me. She seemed to know something about my grandfather that I didn't. The well she referred to could only be the one hidden in the woods behind my cabana, sealed off decades earlier, with warning signs posted to keep anyone from tampering with it. My grandfather Samuel had always told me it was dry and unsafe, nothing more. Still, those words echoed in my head for days until I finally gave in. One Saturday morning, I grabbed a crowbar, pried the cover open, and found not water but a carefully sealed metal box. Inside were photographs, financial ledgers, and a confession letter written by Eugene Blackwood himself. The evidence revealed a darker truth. Eugene wasn't just a gambler or a moonshiner. He had been tied to drug trafficking and illegal weapons deals. The photographs showed him meeting with known criminals, handling firearms, and loading suspicious cargo. The letter to his wife and children admitted everything, ending with Eugene's plea for forgiveness. He claimed he had intended to turn himself in, but fate intervened before he had the chance. My grandfather's notes explained why he had hidden the evidence rather than going to the police. Eugene's partners were still powerful and dangerous. Exposing them could have brought violent retribution on the Blackwood family. Samuel chose to shoulder the disgrace himself, protecting Eugene's widow and children by keeping the truth buried. But the most shocking find was a letter written to me by my grandfather shortly before his death. In it, he revealed that while most of Eugene's fortune had been seized by the government, he had secretly safeguarded what remained at nearly $200,000, growing it quietly over the years. That money, he explained, rightfully belonged to Eugene's descendants. It was a staggering realization. Diana had spent her life waging war against the man who had not only saved her great-grandfather's life but had also protected her family's inheritance for decades. I decided Diana deserved to know. 3 days later, I met with her and her attorney. She looked exhausted, her fire burned out. When I laid out the photographs, Eugene's letter, and finally the trust documents, something unexpected happened. She laughed, not with bitterness, but with relief, as though a crushing weight had finally been lifted. "My whole life," she whispered, tears streaming, "I've hated your family, and all this time, your grandfather was protecting mine." Seeing her transformation was astonishing. The anger that had fueled her for decades seemed to vanish, replaced with peace. She even asked if there was a way to make amends. That's when I suggested we use part of the inheritance to build something that could heal the valley instead of dividing it. And so, we did. On the land where her great-grandfather's farm once stood, we built a community center, a place for gatherings, education, and honest remembrance of the valley's real history, not the myths passed down through generations. Diana threw herself into the project with the same intensity she had once dedicated to revenge, only now she was building instead of destroying. Watching her lead the community with purpose, smiling genuinely for the first time, I realized my grandfather's true legacy. It wasn't about winning land disputes or silencing enemies. It was about protecting people, even those who didn't realize it. In the end, the woman who once sought to ruin my family became one of the valley's most respected leaders, thanks to the man she had spent her life hating. And that's how someone who once tried to take my cabin ended up discovering she was heir to a fortune my grandfather had safeguarded for her family. Sometimes life has a way of turning battles into blessings and enemies into allies.